before we get started. I'm Antoinette Nelson and is branch manager for the Science and Engineering Library and the Chemistry Librarian. I have the pleasure of introducing today's guest speaker for Focus on Faculty, Dr. Daniel Armstrong. Professor Armstrong is the Robert A. Welch Professor of Chemistry and Biochemistry at UT Arlington. He received his BS from Washington and Lee University and his MS in Oceanography and PhD Chemistry degrees from Texas A&M University. He is widely published, including 15 patents and an invited speaker worldwide. He has received over 20 awards for teaching and research. His work has provided the impetus for the FDA's regulatory changes regarding chiral drug development in 1992. He has been on the scientific advisory board of 3 companies and 1 university, has started or co-started 2 companies, and he has mentored and advised approximately 160 graduate and postgraduates in obtaining their degrees. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Armstrong as he begins his presentation.
Well, thank you for that kind introduction. I should say right at the outset that I could give a full semester and possibly a full year class on testing for performance-enhancing drugs and laboratory techniques involved in that. And so we have an hour here tonight, so there's no way I can give you something that's comprehensive or even approaching it. At most, I can just hit some of the highlights for you and maybe give you a brief summary. And so that'll be the first half of my talk. In the second half of the talk, I'm going to talk about a specific case we were involved in, the case of a chiral stimulant that was put in workout supplements and has caused a little bit of havoc in the sports area with athletes getting banned and so forth. So let's start off. We should define performance-enhancing drugs at the beginning, at the outset. They're substances used by people to improve their performance in sports in which they engaged. But the term is also used to refer to drugs used by military personnel to improve combat performance. And in fact, these are inexplicably linked. You don't get as much publicity, news items on the military use, but throughout history, they have been connected and are still connected today. We'll, of course, focus on the sport aspect. Now, you can go back to ancient times, the beginning of the Olympics in ancient Greece. And the performers were doing things, whatever they could, to enhance their performance. The Greeks ate high-meat diets. They had wines, potions, herbal medicines. They used hallucinogens. They also ate animal hearts and testicles, which they thought would make them more virile and aggressive and perform better. A lot of civilizations have thought that. None of these things was considered illicit. For the most part, they probably didn't do them a lot of good, except for the universal placebo effect. And you can't underestimate that placebo effect. I mean, when a little kid gets his first pair of new gym shoes, he's absolutely convinced he can run faster and jump higher. The placebo effect is huge right up through adults. What they probably got out of it, in addition to a placebo effect, they also got better nutrition because they ate more meat and more protein when they were training for these things than the average population did. The ancient Greeks didn't eat as much meat, for example, as we do today. Now, if you go to Roman times, you can find recorded instances of performance enhancings with the gladiators, the Roman armies, and so forth. The gladiators used hallucinogens. They used stimulants like strychnine. Of course, strychnine's a very toxic poison, but if you use it in much lower concentrations, it's a stimulant. The dose, after all, is the poison. But what's not widely recognized is the horses were actually probably given much more. The horses were given a variety of alcoholic potions, mainly to lessen pain and fear. You don't want a horse to charge up to the enemy and stop and create a stationary target, or rear up and present its vulnerable underside. That's not good for the horse or the rider. You would prefer them to charge right in the midst of the enemy, knock down and trample as many as possible, while the riders slashed and stabbed those remaining or trying to get up. That's the ideal situation. Now today, although we aren't going to be talking about, horse doping is huge. There's a big problem in horse racing. Maybe read some of the old British novelist Dick Francis novels where he talks about this, and sports doping comes in. And there's huge sports doping testing programs in the United States, in Europe, and so forth. So whatever bad things you've heard about athletes doping, some of them dying, it's happened much more than that for horses. Many more have died, been hurt, and there are many more instances of it. It just doesn't receive the PR. That brings us to the 19th century, where things are starting to get a little more serious in both sports and in doping. In the 19th century, performance-enhancing drugs, PEH, is the acronym for performance-enhancing drugs. It becomes more prevalent, and it continues to escalate for over 200 years. That brings us to the current time. But for the first 140 years or so, it was not considered either illegal or unethical at all. In fact, it was considered it's what you need to do to compete at your best and to finish events in some cases. Also about this time frame, as we were exploring a lot of the rest of the world, we found that indigenous populations in certain parts of the world were chewing roots and leaves that gave them stimulant effects, things like coca leaves in South America, cat in the Middle East. And while the indigenous populations have known about this for probably hundreds of years, now the rest of the world was learning about it as well. When things really start to get focused, athletics and drugs, I think I like to have my starting point in England in the early to late 1800s. And in England, walking races, very long, strenuous walking races, became hugely popular. These races were 500 miles or more, often between towns. They took a week or more to complete. When you were doing a walking race, you didn't sleep, you didn't stop, you went from beginning to end, or you lost and dropped out. And this wasn't casual walking like we do in the park. There are still Olympic walking races. And if you've seen these people, they really move. If you can imagine walking just as fast and hard as you can with the biggest strides possible and doing it for 7 or 8 days without stop, without sleep, you're going to be sore and tired. You're going to have blisters. And so what did they do? They took a variety of opiates, alkaloids, nitroglycerin, anything to help them stay awake, mask the pain, and otherwise get them to finish the event. And these were hugely popular spectator sports. 20,000 people a day were watching this. And the promoters took notice, because when there's people, when there's spectators, when there are fans, there's money to be made. This was the start of wide-scale doping for people doing distance events. As I said, the promoters saw this, and they decided, because of the popularity of these events, they decided to hold similar races for bicyclists. This is the start of all bicycle racing, from the Tour de France to Olympic events, all of the international. It starts here as an offshoot of these marathon walking races in England. And I pulled several quotes out because people would think I'm embellishing the truth if I just said them. So this is a quote. This is from a promoter. "A tired walker, after all, merely sits down. A tired cyclist falls off and possibly brings others crashing down as well. That's much more fun." But he didn't say also much more profitable, yet you get more of an audience out there. So this is an exact quote. Some of the drugs, and I should say, let's go back to that slide. So you shouldn't be surprised that the cyclists doing these events were using all the same drugs that the walkers and the long distance people were using in order to finish them. It was considered something you had to do to finish these events. Nobody took any exception with it. One of the early stimulants that gained a lot of attention was benzodrine. It's the trade name for amphetamine. A street name is speed. Benzodrine was widely used in the Berlin Olympics. In the 1936, it was extensively used by British troops and some Americans in the Second World War. After that, it was used widely by American truck drivers doing long hauls to stay awake. It caused accidents. It also caused accidents with the British RAF because if you're going 48, 4 days without any sleep, mission after mission after mission, your judgment and timing tend to go downhill, and so forth. And of course, this and similar drugs proved irresistible to people in many sports, including cycling. And there's another quote from a British professional cyclist. He was well known in the 1950s and 1960s. And as he said, you need never go off course chasing the peloton in a big race. Just follow the trail of empty syringes and dope wrappers, and you won't get lost. Now let's take a look at the different types of performance-enhancing drugs. These are general categories that you need to be familiar with if you're interested in this field at all. The first one is lean mass builders. The lean mass builders are the anabolic steroids and human growth hormone, and we're going to talk about these a little bit. They've received obviously a lot of press lately with the Balco scandal, the Barry Bonds, Roger Clemens, and so forth. Ben Johnson in the Olympics in 1999. The next class are stimulants, amphetamine, methamphetamine. This abbreviation DMAA stands for dimethylamine. I'm going to be talking about that in the last half of this talk specifically. Sedatives, beta blockers, Valium, alcohol. You might wonder, why on earth are athletes taking sedatives? I mean, won't it hurt their performance? Well, in most cases, yes, unless you're a marksman. If you're doing competitive riflery or archery, sedatives help your aim because there's always a little bit of motion in your arms and when the heart beats. And anything you can do to lessen that motion and become more consistent will improve the aim and improve the score. And so these are tested for, mainly for riflemen and the archery folks. Painkillers, narcotics, non-steroidal anti-inflammatories. Some increase the blood pressure for greater oxygen flow. Not all of these are illegal. The narcotics are, or banned. Some non-steroidal anti-inflammatories we take, like ibuprofen, things like that, are not banned. We already did painkiller. Diuretics. These are drugs that expel water. And these are mainly used by wrestlers trying to make weight. You have to make whatever it is, the 134-pound weight category, and you're 140 pounds, and you're going to get weighed in 5 hours. You've got to lose 6 pounds fast. And so they take a lot of diuretics to lose the water weight to get down to weight. But another big use of diuretics is to excrete banned substances. If you know you're going to get drug tested in, let's say, 24 hours to 48 hours, and you've been taking some banned substance, what you do is you drink as much water or Gatorade as you can. You take the diuretics, which cause you to urinate and flush it out. You're essentially flushing the system as fast as you can to remove those drugs. Now, that works pretty well for water-soluble drugs. It doesn't work for fat-soluble drugs like steroids, for example. Water-soluble drugs like the amphetamines, the stimulants, and many others, they have maybe a 12 to 24 to 48 hour lifetime. So you can get rid of those pretty easily and quickly. Steroids, on the other hand, are very lipophilic and fat-soluble. They have a 30 to 40 day lifetime. So you have to quit taking those a long time before your event. And since they've implemented random testing, it's a little bit more difficult to get away with it. Blood doping. Blood doping is widely used by cyclists, distance runners, and so forth. It simply consists of boosting the number of red blood cells. And you can do that either by transfusions or by taking the hormone erythropoietin, and we'll talk about that briefly a little bit later. So these are the things people do. This is the agency that was formed to test for this. The World Anti-Doping Agency, or WADA, now does all the Olympic testing and testing for 600 other sports organizations. They've developed the World Anti-Doping Code, which lists the things that are banned and so forth. This was formed in 1999 by an action of the International Olympic Committee and some other organizations. And so now it does most of the testing. Now let's talk briefly about steroids. They've been in the news an awful lot lately. there aren't just 3 steroids, there's 3 molecules. Here, the top molecule is testosterone. It's the natural hormone. We all have testosterone. It's the hormone that makes us males so lovable. And lose hair and aggression and all the rest of that sort of thing. But it is normal. Women have a certain degree of testosterone as well, but at a lower level. And so it's a natural hormone. We all have it in our system, but at certain levels. You can take extra testosterone and boost its effect. And in fact, it was widely used by the Russian and Eastern European athletes in the 1950s and 1960s. In fact, there was a great story about the American doctor there. The American Olympic team had a doctor, and he was in a bar, and he was drinking with a Russian trainer, and they were knocking back a few. And a little later on, the Russian sort of elbowed him in the side and said, "What do you give your boys?" And the American said, "Excuse me? What do you give our boys? We give our boys testosterone." And so the American doctor went home after the Olympics. Said, "They're giving their boys testosterone. We've got to do something for our boys." So the American contribution was the steroid that's just below testosterone. These things look very, very similar to each other. But there's one difference I want to point to. This molecule, this blue arrow is pointing to this little stick, which represents a methyl group. You put a methyl group right here, and otherwise it's very similar to testosterone, has the same effects, but it changes something very interesting and useful. Testosterone, you see, needs to be injected in order to get its full effect. If you take it orally as a pill, it's only 10-12% effective. It's not very effective as an oral drug because your body clears it quickly and changes it. On the other hand, if you put a small group right here by this OH group, it enhances the oral availability to over 90%. So now you can take it orally and get the same effects as injecting testosterone. The name for this was Dynabol. It was out in the late 60s, early 70s. And the reason it made it available orally is your body couldn't metabolize it, change it, and excrete it as quickly as it could testosterone. Now, this was good for oral availability, but it had a big downside. Because your body couldn't degrade it, it tended to collect. And there are always a series of people who think if a little bit is good, more is better. And so they would start taking massive amounts of this stuff. The organ in your body that detoxes steroids is the liver. And so what would happen, they'd build up large amounts of this stuff in the liver, which had trouble detoxifying it, and they had so much there that you would cause liver damage, and sometimes liver failure. And as you all know, we can't live without a liver. So that happened. And that's always the problem. If you're talking about sports doping or anything else, there's the core that will do it, and there's a core that thinks if some is good, more is better. This last one, and there are many more than these I'm showing, is THD, tetrahydrogestrinone. This is the designer drug of the Balco-Stanbol, one of the designer drugs of the Balco-Stanbol. You might notice instead of a methyl group, it has an ethyl group here. So, elevated testosterone was banned, Dynabol was banned, so a chemist went in and put, instead of a methyl group, an ethyl group, instead of a methyl group here, an ethyl group here. It wasn't banned because nobody had seen it before. It was a different molecule, slightly different. A little bit different molecular weight, but it's not on the ban list, legal. And they reused that. It took them a few years to discover this. They banned this one, and then they tweaked the structure again and came out with another new one. That's called designer drugs. Now, the other anabolic agent is HGH, human growth hormone. And this was used very widely up to the present time. It also is an anabolic agent, allows you to put on muscle mass more quickly. It spurs angiogenesis, which is the formation of blood vessels. If you're putting on muscles, you have to have blood vessels to supply them with nutrients and oxygen. That's what human growth hormone does. It's been abused in sports since the 70s. It was banned by the Olympic Committee and the NCAA. in the 90s, but it was a toothless ban because they had no test. This is a natural hormone, and they had no test for it until 2004. This was the first time they had developed a test for synthetic human growth hormones at the Olympic Games in Athens, Greece. And you might recall at this Olympics, a lot of athletes went to Athens and turned around and went home without competing in their event. And many more were caught. That's because this is the first time they had this test, and so everybody was getting caught. They were off the steroids, many of them, and taking this, they thought, safely until 2004. Now, human growth hormone is necessary. We all have it as a part of our makeup. It is a protein. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the chemistry. If you could see the molecule, this is what it would look like, sort of a Y shape. And what it does is it stimulates growth, lean muscle mass, and angiogenesis. When you are a child, this is the hormone that your pituitary secretes to make you grow. When you're a child, your growth plates in your leg and in other bones are not fastened, and so they can grow and you get taller and so forth. However, if you have excess human growth hormone as a child, you will suffer from the condition known as giantism. And there are several well-known examples of this. Either the pituitary is putting out too much human growth hormone, sometimes there's a tumor on the pituitary. One well-known example of this is Andre the Giant, a French-born professional wrestler, 7 feet 4 inches tall, 500 pounds. This is Andre versus the crowd, normal-sized people. He suffered from giantism. Another well-known example of giantism is Robert Wadlow. He's in the Guinness Book of World Record, the tallest man who ever lived. He was 8 feet 11 inches tall, and here he is compared to his father, who was a 6-footer, essentially. So, having the right amount of a hormone is best. If you have too much or too little, you suffer. These folks had too much. People that suffer from giantism also tend to have short lifespans, usually from the 20s to the 40s at most. This was used widely by track athletes, and after you're full grown, in addition to building muscle, the human growth hormone has another effect on the jaw. The jaw sometimes can grow into your 20s, 30s, or be stimulated to grow. And so I had a friend who was the track coach at Rice, and he said, if you notice several of these athletes in college and when you go to the Olympic trials and stuff, are in braces rather late in life. Most people get their braces when they're 12, 13, 14, something like that. So these were people in their 20s, and they all had braces because the human growth hormone changes the shape of the jaw somewhat. Their teeth get crooked and out of kilter, and they have to go into braces to straighten them out. He said that 90% of the time, that's what's going on in these cases. The last general technique we'll talk about is blood doping. As I said, it's a more recent technique of enhancing the performance, especially in aerobic sports. It consists of any action to increase one's red blood cell levels above normal. 2 are banned, 1 is not banned. Originally, what you would do is you'd give blood. That blood would be preserved. It takes 4 to 6 weeks to build up naturally your red blood cell content. So you do that, so you'd have to do it early on in your training. And then just before your event, it was transfused, and you would have many more red blood cells, which are responsible for carrying oxygen. Therefore, you didn't get tired as much. That was the old way of blood doping. The new way is to use the hormone erythropoietin, which is a natural hormone that stimulates red blood cell production in all of us. Without it, we wouldn't produce red blood cells and we would eventually die. So they developed a way to make synthetic erythropoietin, which is also a protein. Shown here, there's this 3-dimensional structure, if you can see the molecule, and this stimulates red blood cell production without having to go through the transfusions. And like the human growth hormone, they didn't have a good test for this until the early 2000s, and so people could pretty much get away with it even though it was banned. Okay, now anabolic steroids have received much of the recent press. But I'm putting it to you that stimulants have a much longer history of use in sports doping, and they still remain one of the most used and abused types of performance-enhancing drugs. And since I was involved in a stimulant case, we're going to focus a little more on that. But before we do, well, let's talk about stimulants first. Stimulants are psychoactive, or psychostimulants are psychoactive drugs. They induce temporary improvements in mental or physical function, or both. And here's the kicker about these things. Some of them have more mental effect, less physical. Some of them have more of a physical effect, less mental. And so they run the gamut of things they can do to you. These are a few of the well-known stimulants. Some are banned, some are not. The xanthines, or theobromine, theophylline, caffeine, you all have caffeine. If you drink coffee, tea, or eat chocolate, you're taking caffeine. It's not banned. Theophylline and theobromine are also in chocolate. Small wonder, they're chocoholics. They get a big mood boost from chocolate. You're getting caffeine, theophylline, theobromine. All of them are stimulants. Coke, I think, has, Coke but not Pepsi, has theophylline or theobromine in it. Nicotine, of course, comes from cigarettes, also a stimulant, also from nicotine patches. Amphetamines are virtually all banned. An amphetamine-related molecule, MDMA, which is the street drug, ecstasy, has this huge mental effect. I mean, it doesn't make you much of a better athlete, but you go completely nuts. These are the ones that take the drug and attack the police and all that sort of thing. But apparently they're having a good time while they're doing it from the name, until they get shot or something. It's addictive. Cocaine, also highly addictive and destructive. A lot of different things. Methylphenidate, Ritalin is given to children with attention deficit disorder and so forth. So there's a lot of these, some banned, some not. Now, it has been established, and it's well known for 60, 70, probably over 100 years, 200 years since England walking races, the stimulants enhance performance. Uh-oh, what happened to the... It's not my computer, so I don't know. Are we sure the switch is turned on for the power? It's on?
No, the projector's on. If you do that, it'll turn the projector on.
Okay. The computer's died. This happens to some people with performance-enhancing drugs as well, by the way. But we didn't give it anything, I swear. Sure. Any questions up to now? Yes. I was going to go into that in the next slide. I was going to go into the Balco scandal. A lot of people, some of them are very old. Some of them were created in the 40s and the 50s and are making comebacks. Nutrition companies, and I was going to go into the history of nutrition companies. A lot of these companies created them. Specifically Balco, which is the Bay Area Cooperative, headed by, it'll do the same thing. It's not banned. Yes.
How scientific were the trainers in adjusting the dose to get the maximum effect?
It's like everything. Some are better than others. And that is the trick. It's the dose is the poison. And the dose is also the medicine. And the trouble is, if you have a rigid regime, because you're a little worried about your safety, but you want to compete, most people can do it fairly safely and effectively. Most, not all, we're different phenotypes. But there's always the group that if some is good, more is better, and then they just, like Ben Johnson, for example, not only had huge amounts of steroids, but more than one. Several kind. I mean, he was, even with the more primitive technology of the day, that was an easy find, because he had so much in his system and so many. I mean, I'm surmising here, the question is more, what wasn't he taking? in that particular case. Okay, so we're back up. Well, the battery died or? Okay, so where are we here? Okay, we're back to stimulants. It's known that stimulants can enhance performance in aerobic tasks. It's widely known that distance racers and bicycle racers would take a stimulant before their event so they could pedal harder and longer. But it's less well known that you don't have to do that to get better performance with stimulants. Stimulants can be used in specific ways to enhance your training. So you can do it months and weeks in advance and get just as much or sometimes more of a beneficial effect from the stimulant during pre-event workouts. And we're going to talk about that. Of course, you have to be aware that drugs can also destroy or kill you if you're sensitive to them, if you overdo it. In the 50s, 60s, 70s, many bike riders would die from overheating, heat prostration caused by excess stimulants, and so forth. There's always a certain percentage that go by the wayside. So let's talk about training. Process of working out or getting in shape. It involves pushing yourself at one or more repetitive tasks again and again. And the harder and longer a person can work at a task, generally the better they get at it. That's what athletes do. Now the caveat to this whole thing is, after the workout you need recovery time, and even more important, you have to avoid working to the point of physical injury or mental incapacitation. I mean, if you can work harder, it's great. If you work so hard you tear a muscle or a ligament, then you're finished. So there's always this limit you have to worry about. Now, the vast majority of people don't have the discipline to approach these mental and physical limits, but some people do. So the object for most serious athletes is to be able to train harder and longer, but to stop short of injury and subsequently be able to recover more quickly so that they can do the workout again, even more hard if possible. Stimulants help the first two. They allow you to train harder and longer, provided you have the mental capacity and feel for your body that you can stop before injury, and so forth. They can help you recover a little bit more, but they tend to increase the risk of injury because you're going longer and harder. So you have to be able to balance these things. And you have to always keep in mind, stimulants also have a psychotropic effect. They change your judgment. They just don't make you more aware. Sometimes they skew your judgment severely, as in the case of ecstasy, cocaine, and some others. And they can be addictive. Now we're getting to the comment that I made earlier when the battery was off the Bay Area Laboratory Cooperative, BALCO. It's a well-known scandal. It's the one, this was the bunch that was involved with Barry Bonds, Roger Clemens, many Olympic athletes, football players. And in reality, it involved many drugs and other substances. BALCO was a nutrition company. They're the one that produced all these things you see at your drugstore on the shelves and everything like that. Victor Conte was the owner of this. As I said, nothing he did at the time he did it, as far as I know, was illegal. The chemist is Patrick Arnold, who I've already described, so I'll skip over this slide except to say he's the father of pro-hormones, and he developed a lot of the design of steroids, and he's also responsible for introducing methylhexylamine, the compound that I'm going to be talking about, into the commercial market. Now, let's go directly to dimethylamylamine, a stereochemical investigation. This is something we did in my group, and I'll tell you why we were asked to do it in a second. So there's this material, 1,3-dimethylamylamine, DMAA, in supplements and geranium plants and products. Is it natural or synthetic? Is it harmless or is it deadly is the question. Focus your attention at this structure right here. That's dimethylamylamine. The structure just above it is amphetamine, street name speed. Look at the similarities in the structure of these two. So this is a banned stimulant. The dimethylamylamine, this part of the molecule is identical. The only difference between this part of the molecule in amphetamine and this part in dimethylamine, if you add 2 more carbons right here and complete the ring, you'll have the same thing as amphetamine. So it's not surprising that it has a somewhat similar effect. What's the mechanism of action of dimethylamylamine? It increases the heart rate, triggers the release of glucose, increases blood flow to the skeletal muscles. That's how they all get their effect in general. Now, a little bit of historical background. Dimethylamylamine was actually discovered by the drug company Eli Lilly in 1944, I believe. Yes, 1944. This is the first paper I could find in the literature in Journal of American Chemical Society. And Eli Lilly was interested in using it as a drug product, nasal antihistamine, and possibly some other uses. After they discovered this, they coined the name Forthane, or is it Forthane as the commercial name for the compound. Several pharmacological studies, that's what drug companies do. They discover a compound, they do pharmacological studies, they get its effects, they try and form a product. These are the pharmacological studies on the DMAA that came out between 1944 and 1960. These are just some of them. But after 1960, I guess it wasn't the best product, or they had other better products for antihistamine, so it was pulled off the market, and it vanished from the face of the earth almost for a period from 1960 up to the mid-90s. For 35 years, nobody had heard or was aware of this compound until 1996. In an obscure Chinese journal, written in Chinese, and it's non-peer reviewed, and it is now obsolete. It doesn't exist anymore. There was an article published on a study of chemical constituents of geranium and geranium oil. It's a simple study. They just took geranium oil and they analyzed it and made a table of all the compounds, all the known compounds they could find that were in geranium oil. There were 30-some, a little over 32, 35 odd compounds. One of the compounds that they claimed to have found was dimethylamylamine. It's just in a table. There were typos in the table, there were experimental problems and so forth. I won't go into those. But nobody, I didn't know this paper, nobody, it was in Chinese, it was a university journal. This university published its own journal, so people within the university could publish a paper in it and say they got a publication. It was not peer reviewed or anything. Now, why does this matter? It matters because Congress, in its wisdom, and we all know how wise Congress is, 2 years before had passed the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act. Prior to this, all these things you see on the shelf, St. John's wort, chondroitin, thing after thing after thing, huge shelves at the drugstore, none of these were out there because this stuff was all regulated by the FDA, none of it worked, and so they didn't allow it. But people objected. There were anecdotal stories. Oh, this helped my joint. Oh, this made me more alert. And there was money to be made. So they pressured Congress. And there were other things as well. Back in the 70s and 80s, there was something called Laetrile, which was an extraction of apricot pits that had cyanide in it. And people thought this might be an effective cancer treatment. 5 minutes, we're going to have to really fly. Do I get the time back from when the computer was off? And so they had to go to Mexico to get these treatments. They didn't work. The people still died from cancer and everything. But they were pressured to pass this act. And so these things, these dietary supplements, were removed from regulation from the Food and Drug Administration. They were no longer regulated. What are dietary supplements or dietary ingredients? The dietary ingredients in these products may include vitamins, minerals, and here's the catch, herbs or other botanical extracts. Boom. Somehow Patrick Arnold found that Chinese paper, or somebody found it for him, and he recognized that dimethylamylamine was a stimulant. So he changed its name to geranamine, the amine from geranium, you see, a natural product. And they started putting geranamine into workout supplements. And it was hugely successful. These sold, a lot of companies made these things. It was the single most sought after used workout supplement because in the words of one of my assistant Zach's friends, this stuff really works. Sure it works. It's got a stimulant in it, okay? 2010, after everybody was using this stuff since 2006, the World Doping Agency put it on their prohibited list. People were using this. They didn't know dimethylamylamine. They were taking a supplement that had geranamine, whatever that was. And so all of a sudden people started getting caught and banned. 9 Aussie athletes, some bicyclists test positive. These were all for the dimethylamylamine. Nigerian sprinters. There's an anecdotal incident where somebody died of a brain hemorrhage who had been drinking alcohol and had taken this workout supplement. Not absolute proof, circumstantial evidence. Then things came to the forefront that if you were taking these workouts and then working out heavily in the heat, you were more prone to heat-related disease, heat exhaustion, and things like this. Then 2 people in the Army died, and the Army began probed. They did autopsy. They found the dimethylamylamine, and they wondered if the soldier deaths could have been related also to taking of this substance. This was in 2011, so we're getting very recent here. In Canada, they began having a debate. In Canada ruled, they said dimethylamylamine is not from geranium. It's a synthetic compound. It shouldn't be allowed in a supplement, a nutritional supplement material. The head of the United Natural Products Alliance agreed, oddly enough, with Canada and said, we think this stuff's synthetic. It's not coming from geranium. In the UK, the whole debate started. Is it a natural product? Is it a synthetic product? Should it be banned? Should it be regulated? Should it not? Then there was one short communication. This group analyzed geranium and geranium products, and they said, we can't find any dimethylamylamine in geranium. One of the main companies that made the product said, this is all a witch hunt. And if you look at their statement, they say DMAA is in fact a constituent of geranium and it's derived oil and has been consumed as a part of the human diet for more than 100 years. So there's a little bit of controversy here. That's when we stepped in, or were asked to step in. We were asked specifically 3 things. Can you tell the difference between natural and synthetic dimethylamylamine? Is the DMAA in supplements natural? Is it from geranium oil or plants, or is it synthetic? Is there any significant concentration of DMAA in geranium plants and products? Well, if we took a look at the structure of DMAA and said, I think we might be able to shed some light on these questions. It turns out dimethylamylamine has 2 chiral centers, one there and one there. Chiral is a word that comes from the Greek meaning handed, right and left-handed. When you have a chiral center like this, or like that, and you make it synthetically by ordinary means, you produce a 50-50 mixture, an exactly 50-50 mixture of the right and left-handed molecules. So dimethylamylamine, actually, because it has 2 chiral centers, consists of 4 different molecules. A 50-50 mixture of these 2, this is the mirror image of that, and a 50-50 mixture of these 2. That is the image of that. And we knew we could buy synthetic stuff, and we could determine if it was a 50-50 mixture or not of these. The techniques we used were gas chromatography, HPLC. I'll skip over this because most of you aren't scientists. First, we measured the diastereomeric ratio. The diastereomeric ratio, you see the first peak is higher than the second peak. It's about 1.3 to 1. This is in standards, synthetic standards that you can buy. Stuff that has been synthesized in the laboratory have this 1.3 to 1 ratio of the 2 diastereomers. So we looked at 13 supplements, and this is the column that lists the diastereomeric ratio. With an experimental error, all the diastereomeric ratios are about 1.3 to 1, exactly the same as the synthetic standards. When you look at the amount of DMAA in these nutrition products, they range from a few tenths percent to a high of 10 to 11%. Percent levels of a small molecule in a plant product is really unusual. I mean, plant products can have thousands of different things in really low concentrations, but 5%, 10% of one small molecule, it's more unlikely. Then to get the enantiomeric ratios, the 50-50, there's only one column in the world we found that could do this. This is the column. It's a GC column. I'll pass this around. If you look very carefully, if you have good eyesight, there's a hole in the middle of this tube. This cage just holds the column. If you unwind this, this can be 40, 50 meters, 150 feet, very long. And we coat this with a special material that allows you to do the separation that I'm going to show you. We invented this column in 1990. This is the paper where we did the invention. It's sold commercially still today by Sapelco. It's based on a molecule called a cyclodextrin. This is the result. The top chromatogram, it's called, is the separation of synthetic DMAA. There's the first pair of enantiomers, 50-50 mixture, same amount. There's the second pair of enantiomers, 50-50, the same amount. Compare the synthetic material with the stuff that was in the workout products. This is one, although all 13 were identical to this. Indistinguishable, both racemates, both 50-50 mixtures in which the enantiomeric ratios are the same as the synthetic and the diastereomeric ratios are the same as the synthetic. We couldn't tell the difference between the two. Skip that one. So the question is, does DMAA really exist in geranium? I will quickly say we took 8 geranium oil samples. We can't analyze everything in the world, so we just took a selection of 4 from the Middle East, 4 from China. We analyzed them by 2 different methods. I'll skip that result. Our less sensitive method, where we can detect 50 parts per billion, this is the geranium oil spiked by a standard, spiked by a 100 part per billion standard. Here's the unspiked sample. We don't see anything. All 8 samples, we couldn't find anything in them. So we went to a more sensitive method, which you see here. Here we can detect 10 parts per billion. And a part per billion is a pretty small amount of stuff. Here's the spiked. Nature's Alchemy spiked it. We spiked it with, I think, 30 parts per billion. If you don't spike it, we don't see anything naturally in there. And we didn't see anything in any of the 8 samples. So the 10 parts per billion level, we couldn't detect in these 8 samples any dimethylamylamine. So our conclusions are threefold. The DMAA extracted from the supplements have the same diastereomeric ratios as the synthetic standards. They're all racemic, just like the synthetic standards. And we found no DMAA in 8 geranium oil samples at the 10 parts per million level. Therefore, it's our general feeling that there's no geranium oil DMAA in workout supplements. They are all synthetic. Consequently, on April 24th, 2012, the FDA finally stepped in order to ban the sales of products. This was fairly recently, that contain DMAA. Now, the question remains, and we're almost done here. The question remains, we only did 8 samples. Is there any plant anywhere that contains some level of this dimethylamylamine? And surprisingly, my answer is yes. There may be a few plants in China or other places. Here's one. It's the Sinochemical plant in Shanghai, and they synthesize DMAA and sell it to the West for about $200 a kilogram. So having said that, this is my research group. They're the ones that do all the laboratory work that allow me to give these talks. And the ones involved in the DMAA project are Sophie, Ross, and Zach. I think, did I miss anyone? It was mainly you 3. that did that particular project. So thank you for your attention. If you have any more questions, I'll try to answer it.